Texas, 1944. The sun burned over a vast field fenced with barbed wire, where hundreds of German prisoners worked under a sky too open to comprehend. Inside a small wooden shed at the edge of Camp Hearn, a team of captured Luftwaffe mechanics was assigned to repair American trucks. Among them was Sergeant Karl Voss, 32, who once maintained Messerschmitt engines in Tunisia. His hands still remembered the scent of aviation oil, sharp, clean, disciplined. What he did not expect was that a simple wooden crate would dismantle everything he believed about German precision. The box was stenciled in bold black, U.S. Army spare parts, bolts, 3/08". Voss pried it open with the tip of a wrench. The bolts inside were wrapped in waxed paper, row after row, each one gleaming the same dull silver. Out of habit, he picked one up, weighed it in his palm, then placed it on a small scale the guards had allowed them to use for calibration. He noted the number, 24.53 grams. The next one, 24.3. The third, identical. Then he measured the diameter, each 0. 375 inches, deviation less than 1/100th of a millimeter. The workshop fell silent. One of the men, Private Gunther Abel, muttered, "Unmöglich. No two hand-forged parts are ever identical." Voss replied softly, "That's because these weren't forged by hands." By noon, the rumor had spread through the camp. The Americans had built machines that made parts as consistent as mathematical constants. The Germans gathered around the crate, running their fingers along the threads. Each was flawless, smooth, interchangeable. No file marks, no variations, no fingerprints of a craftsman. It was as if perfection had lost its humanity and gained something else. In his confiscated diary, later archived at the National Archives, Voss scribbled a single sentence that historians still quote, "We have artisans, they have gods made of iron." At first, they laughed nervously. The men prided themselves on the German tradition of Meisterhandwerk, the master craftsman's touch, the soul in every piece of steel. But this box mocked that belief. If an army could make 1,000,000 bolts without error, what else could it duplicate? Aircraft wings, engines, perhaps entire factories. It was more than a discovery. It was a revelation wrapped in paper and oil. One of the American guards, a former Ford worker named Jim Harlan, noticed their fascination. During the lunch break, he joked, "You boys like our bolts more than your beer?" Then, almost kindly, he explained, "These come from Detroit. Machines make them by the mile." His casual tone hit harder than any propaganda speech. Machines by the mile. That afternoon, as the Texans' country music drifted from a nearby radio, the prisoners continued to test the bolts. Voss lined them up like soldiers, perfect in formation. He realized, with a strange chill, that the Americans had achieved what German command never could: obedience without supervision, precision without pride. That night, in the barracks, conversations swelled between bunks. "Do you think every bolt in their trucks is like this?" one asked. "Every one," another replied. "Then they'll never run out of spare parts." Silence followed, thick with understanding. The war that once felt like a duel of courage now seemed like an equation, one that Germany could no longer solve. Outside, the floodlights hummed, tracing sharp white lines over the camp. Inside, Voss lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He whispered to himself the words that would haunt him for years. Perfection is no longer an art. It has become a system. And somewhere in the darkness, the sound of distant machinery rolled over the plains. An invisible factory breathing, unstoppable, alive. In Germany, before the war, every machine shop carried its own rhythm. The hammer's ring, the master's curse, the apprentice's anxious breath. A single craftsman shaped the fate of every engine. His signature was invisible but unmistakable. When Sergeant Karl Voss had worked at Messerschmitt Augsburg, he could identify which mechanic had filed a piston ring just by sound. Each man's hand had its accent, each error its author. But in America, the hands didn't matter. At the Oklahoma camp's repair depot, a visiting U.S. Army engineer named Thomas Reed demonstrated something no German had ever seen: a torque wrench with a dial calibrated to thousands of identical readings. "Every worker back home uses one," he said simply. To Voss, it looked like witchcraft. He tested it on one of the American bolts. The needle stopped at exactly the same mark every time, 5, 10, 20 attempts. Precision without the master. That night, he wrote in his small notebook, "They do not rely on genius, they rely on certainty." The next morning, during routine duty, the guards allowed them to listen to a broadcast from Detroit, a morale program featuring interviews from the Ford factory floor, voices of women laughing, machines humming in perfect tempo. One said proudly, "If Joe's sick tomorrow, I'll take his spot. Same tools, same gauge, same output." That single line struck harder than artillery. In Germany, replacement was humiliation. In America, it was design. By mid-1944, the numbers confirmed what the prisoners had begun to feel. The United States was producing 7,000 aircraft engines per month, 45,000 Sherman tanks in 3 years, and nearly 100,000 trucks every 6 months. It wasn't talent, it was replication. Every rivet, every bolt, every measurement locked to a standard that never slept. Back in Berlin, engineers at the Reich Ministry for Armaments had already received the captured samples Voss's unit once examined in Tunisia. The report, dated February 17, 1943, described uniform metallurgical composition, identical threads, zero deviation. The final line read, "If their entire supply chain maintains this precision, our skilled labor advantage is nullified." Voss didn't know that memo existed, but he could feel its truth under his fingertips. He remembered his mentor, Master Helmut Kruger, who once told him, "Machines obey men because men know better." Now, watching American workers from afar, he wondered if that age had ended. Here, the machine itself dictated right and wrong. It did not flatter pride. It did not forgive talent. It only measured. The POWs began to talk differently. Abel, the youngest, whispered, "Imagine if we could replace the whole line when one man fell at the front." The thought was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. War had become not about the best soldier, but about who could produce the next one faster, identical, equipped, and fed. In a letter intercepted by the camp censor, Voss wrote to his wife in Stuttgart, "Do not believe the radios. Their power is not in their bombs, but in their repetition. Every man here can be another. Every bolt, every shoe, every thought fits into its place." The letter was never sent, but its words survived in his diary. By September 1944, the prisoners began to mimic what they saw. They organized their repairs with checklists, time cards, rotations. Even without orders, they aligned tools by number, measured output, logged results. The guards called them the neatest mechanics west of Dallas. They smiled, but inside, each German felt the unease of a craftsman watching his soul replaced by a ruler and a clock. As the Texas dusk settled over the camp, the men stood silently by the fence. Beyond the horizon, trains rumbled eastward, carrying steel and fuel toward endless production lines. One of them murmured, "We worship genius. They worship standards." No one argued. The wind carried the scent of machine oil and sagebrush. Two worlds blending, one dying quietly inside the other. By winter 1944, the world outside the camp was collapsing, but the American factories were only getting louder. Rumors reached the prisoners through newspapers and guards' conversations. A place in Michigan called Willow Run could now build a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Another plant at River Rouge, near Detroit, could turn raw ore into a complete vehicle in less than 48 hours. To men like Karl Voss, who once believed that mastery was sacred, these numbers sounded unreal or sacrilegious. In Germany, a factory was an orchestra led by a few great conductors. In America, it was a heartbeat that didn't stop for breath. The prisoners began to hear more stories from guards who had worked in those places before joining the army. One said that at Willow Run, 42,000 workers labored under a single roof so vast that it contained 3.5 million square feet of assembly lines. Each man and woman performed a motion, twist, lift, press, again and again, 8 hours straight. "We didn't build planes," the guard joked. "We built minutes." That phrase haunted Voss. He tried to picture it, thousands of identical bolts like those from the crate, tightening into wings without a single mind knowing which bomber they belonged to. A man in Illinois stamping metal panels. A woman in Ohio threading wires she would never see in flight. Together, They formed an invisible machine far greater than any engine. The machine of unity. Inside the Texas workshop, Voss arranged a small experiment. He and 4 others decided to mimic an American line. Each man was assigned one motion: thread, tighten, pass. At first they laughed. By the second hour they fell into rhythm. By the third, something eerie happened. No one spoke, yet everything moved perfectly. A chain of bodies operating as one. When they stopped for water, silence felt like breaking glass. Private Abel said, "We didn't think, we just worked." Voss nodded slowly. And that's why they win. Across the Atlantic, the Reich was breaking apart under bombing raids. Factories in Essen and Kassel were reduced to ash. Skilled labor vanished with every airstrike. Yet here, in captivity, Germans saw the face of their replacement. Not a soldier, not a genius, but a system immune to fatigue. That night, a guard allowed them to look at a magazine photo from life. Rows of women in denim overalls, hair tied with scarves, tightening bolts on a bomber fuselage. "Rosie the Riveter," the caption read. Beneath it, the words, "We can do it." Abel stared at the photo and whispered, "They don't even look like soldiers." Voss replied, "They don't need to." Each image was a mirror showing what Germany could never be. A society where a worker on the line mattered as much as the engineer behind the desk. The hand of the master had been replaced by 1,000 steady hands that never asked for glory. In the camp's dim light, the Germans began to argue. Was this progress or the death of art? Some called it soulless, others inevitable. Yet all of them felt the same chill. If humanity could vanish from production and perfection still rise, what was left to be proud of? As midnight approached, a train whistle echoed far across the plains. Voss imagined its cargo, bolts, wings, engines, moving toward a horizon of fire. He thought of his home in Augsburg, of the old factory where each man signed his work with a scratch of initials. He wondered if those initials still meant anything. He closed his notebook with a single line: "One man, one motion, one nation, moving as a machine." And when the lights went out, the rhythmic hum of the camp generator carried through the cold, sounding almost like breathing. Mechanical, eternal, and impossibly human. The frost of early 1945 crept across the Texas plains, and the war's outcome was already written in steel and smoke. In Camp Hearn, the German mechanics continued their daily repairs on captured U.S. trucks, but something inside them had shifted. What once felt like humiliation had turned into uneasy fascination. They wanted to understand how the Americans achieved such flawlessness, how a nation of ordinary people had built a system so perfect it could think for itself. During inspection week, an American technical officer named Lieutenant Frank Mallory brought in a portable gauge reader, a squat metal box with dials, lights, and a small buzzer. He placed one of the bolts from the crate under its sensor, pressed a switch, and a green light blinked. Then he loosened the bolt slightly, and the light turned red with a sharp buzz. "It stops the line when something's wrong," Mallory said simply. "Nobody argues. The machine knows." The Germans stared in silence. Machines that could correct men, not the other way around. Karl Voss leaned closer, watching the tiny electric light flicker between perfection and failure. It was binary truth. No emotions, no excuses. He wrote that night, "If all parts are identical, one flaw should doom them all. But here, the flaw itself is contained, trapped by logic. Their system forgives nothing, yet needs no master to forgive." The prisoners began to realize what this meant. Germany's system required oversight. Supervisors, foremen, inspectors, all relying on authority. America's system relied on calibration. Once the rule was written into the tool, it governed itself. A worker didn't have to understand metallurgy or torque. The wrench would tell him when he was right and when he was wrong. It was a silent revolution, intelligence relocated from people into process. That week, the camp guards received a new delivery truck from Fort Worth. When it arrived, the prisoners were allowed to inspect its engine for maintenance. As they lifted the hood, they noticed tiny stamps on every component, coded serials matching the same standard pattern they'd seen before. Carburetors from Rochester, pistons from Cleveland, bolts from Detroit, all fit together with eerie precision, despite never meeting each other until this very moment. Voss whispered, "They build like they believe in destiny." He wasn't exaggerating. The American system's power was not in any single genius, but in interchangeability. It was an idea that had begun a century earlier with the Springfield Armory's muskets and matured under Ford's assembly line. By 1944, it ruled every factory from Buffalo to Burbank. In Berlin, Albert Speer still clung to the old belief that supervision and punishment drove production. Yet in this prison, the captured engineers were discovering that discipline had been replaced by measurement. Abel, the youngest, watched the gauge blink and muttered, "If machines can judge us, what's left for pride?" Voss replied quietly, "Perhaps pride must evolve." As spring approached, they noticed another strange ritual. Every Friday, the Americans recalibrated their tools. The guards joked that even the wrenches went to church once a week. Precision here was treated with reverence. The Germans had worshipped the Meister. The Americans worshipped the margin of error. When the prisoners returned to their barracks that evening, the generator outside coughed once, then steadied. The light inside flickered, stabilizing into a constant glow. It reminded Voss of that gauge reader, a system correcting itself before failure. He closed his eyes, and the realization sank deep. The Americans had built not just machines that moved, but machines that learned to think alike. The age of the craftsman had ended. The age of the system had begun. And in the quiet between those two worlds, a few captured Germans understood, with a mix of awe and sorrow, that they had witnessed the birth of something far larger than war. By April 1945, rumors seeped through the camp fences like the Texas wind. Berlin was burning, the Reich collapsing, and Hitler's voice had gone silent. Yet inside the wire, another kind of fear had taken hold among the German mechanics, the fear of infinity. It began with a question from Private Abel one humid morning as they repaired an army jeep. "If they can make 1,000,000 of bolts identical," he asked, "what can't they make?" The others fell silent. It wasn't the kind of silence born of defeat, but of realization. A machine that could endlessly replicate perfection was more terrifying than any bomb. One of the guards, Corporal Harlan, showed them a newspaper with a photograph of Ford's Rouge plant, acres of moving belts glowing under steel rafters, sparks falling like rain. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Continuous 24-hour production, 365 days a year." Voss traced the image with his finger. "It doesn't stop," he whispered. "It never sleeps." He remembered the German factories at home, their power cut at night to hide from bombers, workers exhausted and half-starved. In contrast, these American plants thrived like living organisms, fueled by electricity, rhythm, and certainty. To a soldier raised on hierarchy, it felt like witnessing the birth of a god made of repetition. That evening, during roll call, thunder echoed far away. The men sat on their bunks, the rain tapping on the tin roof in perfect cadence, like an assembly line of the sky. The rhythmic sound stirred the same unease, an image of something that moved forever, never tiring, never dying. Voss tried to shake it off, but in his diary he admitted, "This is not the terror of defeat. It is the terror of endless creation." He wasn't alone. Another prisoner, Otto Feldman, once a design engineer at Daimler-Benz, confessed during a discussion, "We built art. They built immortality." The group fell silent. None dared laugh at the irony. By May, word spread that the war was over, but the fear remained. In the workshop, as the Americans handed them new crates of replacement parts, the Germans noticed something chilling. The same bolts again, same label, same flawless precision. 3 years into captivity, and nothing had changed. No shortages, no improvisation, no decline. America had simply multiplied its perfection. Voss lifted one of the bolts to his ear, hearing the faint metallic chime. He imagined millions like it, scattered across continents, in trucks, planes, ships, bridges, a single note repeated across the world. "This," he murmured, "is the sound of power." That night, as the prisoners sat by the fence, they watched headlights flicker from a distant highway. Trucks passed one after another, identical silhouettes carrying identical cargo, all moving towards cities whose lights never dimmed. Abel asked, half to himself, "If everything can be made again, what becomes of meaning?" Voss answered, "Perhaps meaning is the one thing they cannot mass produce." The question lingered in the dark, heavier than the war itself. If you were standing there, behind the wire, staring at a world that could build without pause, would you feel hope or horror? Would the promise of perfection inspire you or swallow you whole? Back in the barracks, a generator roared to life, steady and unending. Its pulse was the same as the one they'd felt since the day they opened that crate. A rhythm beyond nations, beyond men. And in that hum, every prisoner heard the same realization, that the future no longer belonged to skill, but to replication. The terror was not in losing the war. It was in realizing that the war had already been replaced by something eternal. Summer 1945 arrived with the scent of rain and diesel, and the camp's routines began to loosen. Victory had been declared, but for the prisoners, freedom was still measured in hours of labor and thin envelopes of news. One afternoon, a convoy arrived carrying civilian visitors, a group of engineers from the Office of War Production, touring POW camps to observe how captured specialists were adapting to American repair systems. Among them was a man who introduced himself as Richard Hale, formerly chief technician under industrialist Henry Kaiser, the builder of Liberty ships. Hale was tall, weathered, the kind of man who spoke with numbers instead of adjectives. He walked through the dusty workshop, watching the Germans work, and then gathered them around the same crate of bolts that had started their fascination months before. "You boys ever seen one of these built?" he asked. Voss shook his head. Hale smiled faintly. "Takes about 1.2 seconds. The machine cuts, measures, and drops it into a bin. If it's off by more than a hair, the next machine melts it right back down. Nothing leaves the line imperfect." The prisoners exchanged glances, disbelief mixed with envy. In Germany, a machinist could spend an hour perfecting a single thread. Hale continued, explaining that Kaiser's shipyards had produced 2,710 Liberty ships in just 4 years, one completed every 4.5 days, some even in under a week. "That's not speed," he said, tapping the bolt. "That's coordination." Voss asked quietly, "And what happens if the machines fail?" "They don't," Hale answered, "because they expect failure and correct it before it happens." It was the first time the Germans had heard that idea, a system designed to forgive itself. In the Reich, mistakes were punished. Here, they were recycled. Hale stayed for an hour, answering questions about gauges, conveyor calibrations, and even union shifts. He spoke without arrogance, only pride in the ordinary people who kept the lines running. When he left, he handed Voss a single bolt. "Keep it," he said, "a souvenir of how we build not with hands, but with trust." That night, the barracks glowed dimly under a storm. Voss held the bolt in his palm, feeling its weight. It was identical to thousands he'd seen, yet somehow unique, because now he understood the faith behind it. Machines, yes, but also belief. That systems could outlast genius, that perfection could be democratic. In his diary, he wrote, "We once built beauty for beauty's sake. They built certainty for survival." The next day, during work detail, one of the guards tuned the camp radio to a Chicago broadcast. The announcer spoke of post-war plans, highways, schools, industries, all powered by the same efficiency that had won the war. Voss realized that this was not just an economic order, but a moral one. Efficiency had become virtue. Abel, sitting beside him, whispered, "Perhaps they love machines too much." Voss replied, "No, they love what machines promise, equality." The others didn't answer. But as they worked, they began to tighten each bolt, not as craftsmen, but as students, mimicking the tempo of an invisible nation. Later that evening, Voss stood by the fence, watching the sunset melt into the endless plains. He thought of Hale's words, "Nothing leaves imperfect." In that orange light, he felt both admiration and loss. The perfection that once terrified him now seemed oddly humane. A system that removed arrogance, error, and even cruelty by surrendering to precision. Can efficiency become a moral force? When everything is predictable and flawless, does humanity vanish or finally find peace? The question lingered as the sun vanished, leaving the sky streaked with steel blue twilight. The sound of machines from a nearby depot carried through the air like a distant prayer, repeating endlessly, steady, patient, and strangely comforting. The spring of 1946 brought the sound of homecomings. The war was over, the camps were emptying, and the German prisoners were preparing for repatriation. Trucks lined the dusty road outside Camp Hearn, ready to carry them to the port at Galveston. For many, freedom felt hollow. They were returning to cities reduced to rubble. Yet for Karl Voss, Freedom meant facing the world with new eyes, eyes that had seen perfection stripped of pride and replaced with purpose. On his final morning, he wrapped his few belongings, a notebook, a worn wrench, and the single American bolt Richard Hale had given him. The guard who stamped his departure papers said with a grin, "Take care, Fritz. Maybe one day you'll build something for peace." Voss smiled faintly but said nothing. The journey back to Germany was long, ships creaking across the Atlantic, trains rumbling through shattered Europe. When Voss reached Munich, he found the city silent, its once grand workshops now graves of twisted metal. His former factory had been reduced to a pile of burned girders, but inside a surviving classroom of the Polytechnic Institute, he found a few surviving engineers, men and women hungry to rebuild. They invited him to teach mechanical drafting and tolerances. It was there, in 1953, that he placed the same American bolt on the lecture table and told his students, "This was made by a system that believed every soldier deserved the same chance to come home alive." The room fell quiet. He rolled the bolt toward them, the threads catching light from the window. "Perfection," he said softly, "is not art. It is compassion measured in steel." Behind him, the chalkboard still bore equations for torque and stress, but his words cut deeper. He explained how, in 1944, he had believed that sameness killed the soul. Now, he saw that sameness could also mean fairness, that in the right hands, standardization was democracy made tangible. Every engine that worked the same, every spare part that fit every gun, every bolt that held every plane together, all of it meant fewer men left stranded, fewer planes lost because one craftsman's pride had chosen beauty over compatibility. One student asked, "Did it feel soulless, Herr Voss, to see machines replace men?" He smiled sadly. "It felt inevitable. But perhaps that is not death. Perhaps that is mercy." Outside, the new Germany was already humming again. Opel, Siemens, and Messerschmitt reborn under new orders, rebuilding the same precision that once destroyed and now sustained. And in that new rhythm, Voss heard the echo of Texas, the buzz of the gauge reader, the hum of the generator, the whisper of a system that never forgot its measure. He kept the bolt in his pocket until his death in 1971. When they cleared his desk, his diary was found with a final note. "I feared the machine once. Now I understand. It was never the enemy, it was the mirror." The film fades on that image, a classroom lit by the morning sun, the sound of distant machinery blending with children's laughter outside. The camera lingers on the bolt, motionless, reflecting both past and present, proof that perfection, once terrifying, could evolve into a promise. For a moment, everything is still, the light, the dust, the steel. And in that silence, history breathes again, not as triumph or defeat, but as understanding. History does not end with explosions. It ends with silence, with men like Karl Voss sitting at a workbench, touching a piece of metal and realizing it carries more memory than words ever could. What began as a discovery in a Texas prison workshop became a meditation on what civilization truly means. The identical bolts that once terrified a generation of engineers revealed something deeper, that the strength of a nation is not born from genius alone, but from its ability to make excellence ordinary. The Americans had not sought beauty in every piece of steel. They sought reliability. And in that reliability, there was a kind of morality, a quiet refusal to let chance decide who lives, who flies, who returns home. Precision, Voss would later teach, was an ethical act disguised as engineering. As Germany rebuilt, the old pride of the master craftsman gave way to a new humility, the understanding that perfection could be shared, not owned. The same ideas that once fueled war were now shaping peace. Cars that lasted, bridges that held, machines that served rather than conquered. The lesson had crossed the ocean, not through ideology, but through observation, through a box of bolts, and the realization that uniformity, in the right light, could be compassion in metal form. Years later, in archives and museums, historians still find his notes, faint pencil lines describing tolerance margins, alongside thoughts about humanity and control. "We once believed that individuality was sacred," one entry reads. But perhaps the true test of civilization is how we build for others, not ourselves. Outside the classroom window of post-war Munich, the hum of new factories blended with birdsong. The war had ended, but its echoes continued. Not in violence, but in rhythm, in the constant pulse of progress and memory intertwined. Every bolt, every thread, every turn of the wrench carried that paradox. The capacity to destroy and to protect, to enslave and to liberate, to build a world that could both terrify and redeem. So when we look at history, at machines, at systems, at the cold perfection of metal, we must also look for the warmth that hid inside it. Because within every identical bolt lies a human hope that through repetition we might finally get something right.